Alrighty-o, welcome back to the channel where I am finally getting back to some book reviews here. And today I wanted to do a little known book. Some of you may have heard about it. It's called The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. So this book, of course, everybody knows about it. I've never talked about it on my channel just because I hadn't actually reread this in probably 15 or so years, probably even longer than that. But I did decide the one good thing coming out of the Ring of Power TV show for me was it made me want to get back into Tolkien's work and actually read the books to get a better experience. So, talking about The Hobbit today. This book really began a journey for so many fantasy readers, and although it wasn't the first thing that I read in the fantasy genre, it was one of the first books that I read in the genre. Around the same time that I was reading things like Harry Potter, Aragon, The Hobbit obviously was, had been around for a while. I'd always, I watched the Lord of the Rings cartoon movie thing that existed. And I was, of course, really pumped around the time of the release of the Lord of the Rings movies. So I did finally get around to reading The Hobbit. This wasn't one of the first things that I read at, age 9 or 10 or whatever it was. I was probably mid-teens, but here I am finally talking about it at age 32. And I still love it, and it brought back so many great memories and also jogged a few things back into my brain that I forgot happened in this book. So first and foremost, what is fantastic about this story is how accessible it is. It's not only a adult fantasy or a children's fantasy story, it is constantly catered towards kids, which I think is actually a great thing because it is a good entry point into the genre. It reads very easily for the most part. There's not quite the level of things that people complain about Tolkien's writing in the Lord of the Rings proper, where some of the language is a little bit dated, things like that may turn a younger reader away from the book. The Hobbit doesn't really read that way. There's lots of songs. There's lots of great dialogue between Bilbo and the other characters. Tons of fun and adventure. And this book really flies through several different events, which I kind of understand the reasoning why they tried to make it a trilogy movie. I think they did stretch out too little information over too many movies, but I understand why, because basically the way that the book is structured, you have Bilbo sort of reluctantly thrust into this journey at the behest of Gandalf and the 13 dwarves that are there, led by Thorin, to go on this quest to basically recapture their gold and their, birthright place in the mountain that has been kind of taken over by Smaug, who has sort of desolated all these dwarves there. So you have Bilbo, this reluctant protagonist, that gets put in way over his head, basically by force, strongly enticed, I'll say that. And he really is the major focus of this story. You, of course, get introduced to characters like Gandalf, who you will obviously see further on in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The dwarves, not so much. They aren't really part of it. Of course, you do get introduced to Smeagol / Gollum, and it's fantastic. This book really handles their interactions wonderfully, and I think it's one of the highlights of this book, honestly, is the back and forth that Bilbo has deep down in the darkness with Gollum when he meets him. It's a great tit for tat. Their sort of mental wits battle going back and forth, which I have to think, the entire riddle thing, the riddle battle that they go on, which is brilliant and fantastic. And listening to Andy Serkis do this on the audio is wonderful. I kind of think this is where Stephen King got his Wastelands train scene from. That's all I'll say about that, but more on that later. You're quickly introduced to hobbits and Bilbo, and just a little bit about their background and the Shire in general, where they're pretty quiet people. They like to smoke, they like to drink, they like to have fun and be merry, and they're not really adventurers. They don't go on these big, sweeping, epic journeys. So, of course, the reluctant hero that is Bilbo, being the center focus of this, works perfectly in the story as you go through each part of this journey, which they go through a lot. I mean, you go from being taken into deep, cavernous dungeons with dwarves and orcs and goblins and a troll king. You have, a little skirmish there. That's a great scene. You have these sort of like dwarven bullies that are his companions, where they don't really trust this hobbit. They don't trust the reasoning behind bringing him. Gandalf tries to play it off to them as if he's some, world-renowned thief that they need to tag along with. Of course, we as the reader understand why, but the dwarves are very standoffish. They don't trust him one bit. They kind of blame him for a lot of their mishaps throughout. But you get a ton of these great, just sort of goofy scenes almost. Like the comedy is fantastic in this book. Like when you get to the scene of they're nearing the mountain and there's the 3 trolls and they're talking about like their meals and the best way to cook them, and they capture a bunch of the dwarves and they're talking about like, should we smash them and eat them later? Should we boil them alive so they're more tender? I mean, it's just a hilarious back and forth of these 3 incredibly unintelligent, gigantic, ogres, essentially just talking about how best to cook them. And you have Bilbo's interactions with them as well, prior to Gandalf coming and saving the day. It's little scenes like that that really make this book and make it a fun, exciting adventure, because there's not like a ton of violence or war in this book. There's not, a ton of adult themes. I mean, Tolkien never really focuses on a lot of like what modern day fantasy authors focus on, which is, nihilistic worldviews and grim dark and, tons of blood and gore and swearing. This is a little bit more wholesome than that, and I kind of appreciate that now as an adult rereading it again. You get, of course, the awesome character of Smaug and his mental back and forth with Bilbo, talking about riddles and who he is and where he came from. And you have that sort of battle of wits that leads Smaug to, attacking Lake Town based on a little slip up that Bilbo mentions, talking about the barrels that they rode in on. So that was a great moment. And he's just such an intimidating force in the book when you meet him. And I will give the movies credit. That's one thing they did well. Smaug was kind of cool. You, of course, get this fantastic interaction between Bilbo and Gollum. And once again, having Andy Serkis, who played Gollum in the movies, doing the voice of this sort of like anniversary edition, I guess it was, of redoing the audiobook. Having him voice Bilbo and Gollum in that scene really brings it to life. And just the battle of wits going back and forth with the riddles is hilarious. And Bilbo cheats, basically. And Gollum doesn't really understand it at first. And then, escaping that moment is just tons of great moments in this. Something I really like about the storytelling as well is he's constantly saying, like, this event happened as well, but that's a story for another time. Or he'll say, we'll get to that in a moment kind of thing. So, like, the Battle of the 5 Armies that takes place toward the end of the book is mentioned way earlier on, but it's kind of like, we'll tell you about that in a little bit. And when you get to it, it's great. It's a fantastic little battle moment. And what I love about how Tolkien writes these things into the story is it's not every kind of situation has, its place in a novel. But like Wheel of Time, where it leads to the last battle, and the last battle is like 150 pages long. The Battle of the 5 Armies, I don't even remember lasting more than a couple pages. It was basically a couple of great paragraphs of here's what happened. Cool. That part's done. Smaug attacking Lake Town was just like, hey, this random guy Bard is the one that kills the dragon. It's not even like the main protagonist does it. So what I love about the way that Tolkien structured this book is that, of course, you have the reluctant hero in Bilbo, who constantly uses the ring, by the way. That can't be good. But he's not this big, strong warrior archetype. He's not Thorin, who is like the leader of the dwarves and is the warrior, is the leader. Bilbo, much like Frodo later on in Lord of the Rings, is kind of that hero that you don't expect to be the one that saves the day or outsmarts a dragon or outsmarts Gollum, or is the reason that so many of these other, quote unquote, superior races within this world succeed. And that's really appealing to readers, I think, and it kind of makes you believe that anybody from any kind of background could be the savior in a story, whether you are fit for that or not. This book did such a great job of setting up a lot of what was to come in just Middle-earth in general and these books as a whole. I mean, reading this, you see a lot of the stones laid for the foundation of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I mean, introducing you to the dwarves, the elves, the hobbits, wizards, dragons, the orcs, goblins, trolls. I mean, seeing and experiencing all those background, plots and places that you're going to sort of revisit, but from a totally different time period, totally different lens of perspective when you get through the trilogy. It's just fantastic. And then knowing now, at the age that I'm at now, wanting to go and read, the Silmarillion and things that happened even before this, where you're really laying all the groundwork for these stories that took place in such a fantastically realized world. And you only get a glimpse of it in The Hobbit, but it does such a good job of making you intrigued in the world. You already see all the little, seeds being planted of what's to come. And it's just so wonderful and well done. And it's super short, so it's really easy to get through. And again, I think that's why it makes it perfect for so many different audiences. And that's why still to this day, I mean, the copy I have is the 75th anniversary edition. This book has been printed so many times. There's so many different versions of it you can get. Fantastic illustrated editions. Like this one has some illustrations in it too. And they all look great on the shelves. So that's always an added bonus. But Tolkien really was a master of the fantasy genre. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it gets, when it comes to his writing. And you probably can't see it great unless I zoom in, I guess. I am building my Tolkien shelf finally over here, down here. So it's, going to be all things Tolkien in the works there. So that's just a random aside for me. That's what I'm doing down there. But so in conclusion, The Hobbit, fantastic journey to take the reader on, brilliant entryway into the world of Tolkien. It's witty, it's fun, it's heartfelt at times. There's a lot of great songs in it because Tolkien loves to write a song. And I don't know, even though Bilbo's really the only character you get a lot of attachment to in the story because it barely focuses on the dwarves. They don't really get much characterization. Again, Bard is like a random at Lake Town. Gandalf, you do get a little bit out of, but really it's very much focused on Bilbo and his journey as he was, sort of thrust into this adventure. And it's just a fun, good time. Definitely high recommend for me to anybody that likes to read fantasy books. If you haven't read The Hobbit, read it. If you have read it, read it again. It still holds up. It's still fantastic. I love pretty much everything about it. It's great. So until next time, guys.